Hey, everybody. We are set to get started here in just a couple of minutes. We'll just let other folks drop into the webinar and then we'll get started. While we're waiting, I'll change the name on my Zoom so you know who I am. Liliana, you may want to do the same thing.
Um,
I noticed that my last name Doney was misspelled, Keith, so I got that fixed.
Oh,
Sorry about
I think it was my fault when I registered.
well, at least you fixed it.
Yep, all set.
All right, looks like we've got a few more people who are dropping in, so we'll just wait maybe a couple more minutes, let everybody join, and then we will be off to the races. I see some familiar names from our Edtech series so far, so that's very cool. I like to see that people are engaging in this conversation with us and continuing to do so. That's very cool. All right, just give one more minute. John, I just usually wait till about 4 minutes after so everybody has a chance to join.
You bet.
And whenever I'm joining a webinar, I personally am a few minutes late. It's just my habit. So I try to develop content for the audience that I am, I guess. All right. All right. I say we go ahead and get started. John, you ready?
All set.
All right, Liliana, we good? All right.
Perfect.
All right.
Let's
Well,
start.
okay, let's do it. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining our latest webinar in our series on EdTech growth. We are here to talk about growing in the EdTech space and how to keep winning deals in the K-12 market. I'm Keith Harrington. If you haven't met me, I am COO and co-founder of Novel Capital. If you're not familiar with us, I would like to say that you should be. We're a non-dilutive funding platform, which is a fancy way of saying that we provide debt to early stage companies. And we actually have quite a few customers in the EdTech space. My co-founder, Carlos Antequera, built a company in the EdTech space and sold it to Vista Equity several years ago. So we have an affinity for EdTech. We understand it very well, and we work with EdTech companies every day. So that's one of the reasons we're very excited about this series and about having John join us today. To date, we have provided a little over $100 million to slightly more than 150 SaaS companies around the country. So we are definitely in a growth mode and excited to work with more and more companies as we go. More importantly, today I have with me John Doney, president of Alidade Consulting. A lot of you probably know John already. And so you know that he helps EdTech companies build their go-to-market strategy and then guide them as they execute it. And what I think is really cool about John is he's got some very hard-won experience that makes him, from my perspective, unique in this market and in any market. I always enjoy talking to people who have sort of been there and done that. And we have that in John today. So John, if you could just take a quick second to introduce yourself and let everybody know who you are.
Yeah, absolutely, Keith. And it's great to be with you and great to be with so many friends and colleagues joining us virtually today. And I have an affinity for EdTech as well, so I'm right there with you. This is actually my 24th year working in K-12 education on the provider side of the market. And I've had the opportunity to work for some great companies over the years. Apple Education, Power School, Renaissance, School Improvement Network, and then most recently Learn Platform as head of growth there, part of an incredible team led by our CEO and founder, Carl Rectanis, who I know joined you on a webinar a few months back.
Yes, he did.
Had great opportunities to work with many wonderful folks, have learned a ton. On a personal note, I'm based about 30 miles north of Seattle. Lived here with my wife of 34 years, I think this year. Yes, that's right. in our empty nest. So we love to travel the country, visit kids, grandkids, eat good food, and I love to fly fish along the way when I can find the opportunity. So that's a quick intro on me.
Well, thank you, John. I forgot. I think you actually attended our webinar with Carl a couple of months back, and that's how we got started thinking about maybe we should have a conversation like this too. So I do love a little bit of serendipity. That's very cool. So everybody, we're going to talk today across four major themes, well, three major themes. And then we'll probably veer into other topics. But what will help us really make sure that we're staying on topics that you all really care about is if you would do us the favor of dropping any questions that you have into your Q&A box. If you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you all know the drill. You know how this works. Any question you drop in there, we'll make sure that we have a chance to talk it through and answer it for you. So please don't be shy. Ask all the questions you want. We want to make sure that this is a time well spent for you. And that's the best way for us to make sure that we do that. So we are going to cover today Department of Education changes and their potential impacts. I know that's a huge topic of conversation, not just in the EdTech market, but around the country. The importance of engaging with state education agencies, why that's important. Some of it is kind of obvious, and why that importance is actually increasing, and what K-12 EdTech company strategies are best to address the potential impacts of policy changes that are going on. So, John, let's start with the why. You kind of talked about it a little bit, but go a little bit deeper on your bona fides or bona fides if you're sophisticated. Why should people be paying attention to you? I know I said you've been there, done that. You said that too, but go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, sure, Keith. Appreciate the opportunity. So over these past 24 years, I've been fortunate to work in sales or growth leadership roles for companies that develop, implement, and support pretty much every category of solution for K-12 institutions. Enterprise systems in that category, solutions like student information systems, LMSs, ERP systems or HR systems, curriculum systems, assessment systems, professional development systems, as well as EdTech effectiveness systems that we worked on at Learn Platform. So I've learned that's kind of unique. Often folks in K-12 EdTech in particular specialize in maybe a couple of those. But I've also had the opportunity to work with vast numbers of districts as well as state and regional agencies in most states over the years. Learned a lot about their environments, how they function, as well as about some of their dysfunction and challenges. And since Learn Platform's acquisition by Instructure at the end of 2022, I've had a chance to advise company founders and CEOs on their go-to-market strategy, as you mentioned previously, and help them build and develop the functions needed to scale. I've also had the opportunity to work with a number of VC and private equity firms to support their portfolio companies with these services. Things like obviously developing and building biz dev processes and structure, client success, government relations is a big one. And I'll just briefly touch on that. On the government relations front, I've got a network of GR specialists and lobbyists in most states across the country who help keep me informed and engage with my clients as it makes sense. And so over the past, just 18 months, I've collaborated with over 30 EdTech company founders and CEOs to help them sort of navigate challenges, be loyal to their mission as they build go-to-market strategy. And of course, over the last couple of months, that's been, to your point, really focused on how do we prepare to adapt and begin adapting to some of these emerging federal policy shifts. So that's a little bit more on sort of the background that I've had.
I appreciate that. I think your background is impressive. I think, as I've shared with you before, and really appreciate your perspective on some of the questions that we're going to be wrestling with today. As some of them to me have been sort of existential, and they certainly seem that way. But you have been sort of a calming voice, I think is how I described it. Along the lines of, I think one of the first times you and I talked, I was like, John, they're going to shut down the Department of Education. What in the world is going to happen? And you kind of walked me through like, hey, here's how this is likely going to work. If you could just do the same for everybody on the call, kind of tell us what CEOs need to know about what is changing and how it's going to roll out.
Yeah. And there's no question that things have been chaotic under the new administration in terms of the rapid timeframes for making decisions and the impact of those decisions, perceived impact in particular. And with the new federal administration, changes are starting to take shape across education. There's still a lot that has to happen, so we don't know for sure how things are going to play out. But there are things that are already affecting how education companies operate. And to your point, this topic comes up in nearly every conversation I have with CEOs and go-to-market teams currently, as well as investors. Everybody's trying to make sense of what's really happening beyond the headlines. Let me just start. There's two things that consistently, and we've seen this since the beginning of time, there's two things that consistently drive institutional behavior in K-12 for state and local education agencies. First is budget uncertainty, and the second is compliance requirements, both federal and state. The responses from the institutions can vary, but almost always those circumstances impact demand. So, for example, I've been hearing from CEOs and growth leaders recently about delayed decisions, something that we'll often see as districts feel unsure about budgets or policy changes. And some of them are already getting requests from current customers to lower renewal pricing for the upcoming renewal. As districts deal with obviously the closeout of stimulus funding, as well as some pretty significant budget shortfalls in certain states, in addition to the federal activities that are happening. So there's kind of two federal actions that I'll focus on today. And the first one is the March 20th executive order that you mentioned to start phasing out or closing down the U.S. Department of Education. And then closely linked to that is the federal budget, both this year's budget status and then what we know about the proposed, at least from the president's perspective, budget for 2026. And Keith, if I could just share a quick pop quiz question for the group, that'd be all
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So most folks may be aware of this, but I'd love to see in the chat. So who knows what the start and end dates are for the federal fiscal year?
If you know it, raise your hand.
Are we getting any responses there, Keith?
Sally is raising her hand.
Yeah, looks like only Sally knows.
Sally. So Sally, that is absolutely correct in terms of one of the dates. So the federal fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. And I just share that because it's important to keep that in mind, not just as we move forward today, but as we try to navigate some of these shifts and related impacts going forward. So Keith, if it's all right, I'll jump in and talk about kind of the executive order and share a summary of that.
I think that would be great. Yeah, please do.
All right, excellent. So the president's executive order that was issued on March 20th, and I'll read a quote from this, states, quote, "Take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return authority over education to the states and local communities while ensuring the effective and uninterrupted delivery of services, programs, and benefits on which Americans rely." Close quote. A lot there, both explicit as well as implied. Since then, I think we all know that the Department of Education staff's been cut nearly in half. I think there's been about, to date, 1,300 jobs eliminated. And that includes the practical elimination of the National Center for Education Statistics. And then within that, the Institute of Education Sciences, where I think there's only 5 staff that remain. And that's had a significant impact on research and related research funding. There's some talk, like there are in many instances, about some NCES functions moving to other agencies like the U.S. Census Bureau. But again, that's all TBD. Now, again, to your point about sort of the initial panic that this causes, again, we don't know how it will play out in the end, Keith, but fully eliminating the U.S. Department of Education would require a congressional approval. And it's unclear if that would happen,
John, is that congressional approval? I want to put a really fine point on this. Congressional approval, does that mean it's an act of Congress? It is a bill that
It
needs to
is an
pass
act
both
of
houses?
Congress.
Okay.
Yes, correct.
Which is not an easy thing to do.
Not an easy thing to do, arduous, time consuming.
Yeah.
And it's there's only so much energy that the Fed's going to have to focus on certain aspects of these shifts. So again, we'll see how that plays out. But in the meantime, the department is already signaling how administration of some federal programs and the associated funding may change. And these are things that we need to watch closely. One example is that the Trump administration has also proposed moving oversight of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and the associated funding from the U.S. Department of Education to the Department of Health and Human Services. Another one is to move student loan administrations to the Small Business Association. Also would require an act of Congress to do that. So those are really key things to keep in mind. And then the last point that I'll highlight here, before we kind of get into some details around the budget, both current and upcoming, it's important to remember that when it comes to school district budgets, about 10% of public school funding comes from the federal government. And that might sound like a small amount, but it is significant when we consider that district budgets funded by state and local funding, about 90 to 95% of that is tied up in salaries, benefits, facilities, and transportation. So that additional 10% is significant, and it is more discretionary in terms of how districts go about procuring services and products.
I always thought that was a really interesting stat, and it's probably because I myself am not steeped in the Edtech market every day. But that was one of the things that you told me initially was, Keith, it's 10%, which is not insignificant. It is a substantial sum, and it certainly is going to have a real impact. But it's 10% of the funding that districts are generally provided. So there is. So while there will be impact, the damage is and can be contained, at least to some extent. So let's talk about that, about the budget, about how the budget for fiscal 25 works, how the budget for 26 works, and how that's going to play out in your view going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the headlines can make it difficult to know what's actually impacted and kind of how the process works. So let's start with the current fiscal budget, 2025, that we're in. Again, keeping in mind that the fiscal year for this current budget year began on October 1st, 2024, and concludes September 30th, 2025. So first of all, it's important to remember that these federal programs and their associated funding are set by federal law, meaning the president can't unilaterally cut them without an act of Congress. So for example, two of the major funding sources that I'm sure folks here on the call are focused on, and we can delve into details of others on this call or at a later time as well. But funding under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, currently known as ESSA, as reauthorized, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and IDEA funding focused on students with disabilities. A major portion of those funds are based on formula grants. And those funds are distributed. The process kind of works like this. The funds are appropriated. If there's a continuing resolution, which we have happen all the time, where Congress basically agrees to extend the funding process to allow the government to continue to operate, and we're under that now, by the way, then the funds typically are released for those formula-based programs on July 1st. Of each fiscal year for that fiscal year to states. And then there's a balance of funds that are then released, the remaining amount to states around October 1st. Title I's about 18.4 billion in 2025. So 85 to 90% of that will be distributed on July 1 to states, and the balance will be October 1st. IDA is similar, about 50-50 in terms of the July allocation versus the October allocation. So they receive the funding and then they distribute it to districts. And there's a lot of variance from state to state on how that works.
Right.
There are situations where districts can start receiving Title I funding for the current fiscal year based on estimates from the Fed regarding what the appropriation or the distribution amount will be to a state. So they can actually start to receive funds ahead of the actual allocation to the state. Again, this varies from state to state, but that funding distribution can continue typically through the summer, and states usually intend to get those distributed around the beginning of the school year or by the beginning of the school year to support activities for that school year. So that's a little bit more about kind of the timing of the process. We are again under a continuing resolution that was passed on March 15th that will extend government spending through September under current provisions to prevent shutdown. So as we look at the current year, fiscal 2025, those funds are largely secure. Could they be rescinded? Again, it would require Congress to pass a rescission bill to cancel only the unobligated portions of fiscal year.
That seems unlikely.
Very unlikely.
Yeah.
Very unlikely. So yeah, it's largely secure, and the focus now is on, okay, what will the actual impacts be in 2026?
And therein lies the big question. So it's good that there's some certainty for the next several months, 6 months or so, for EdTech companies. So just a quick reminder to everybody: if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll tackle them as they come in. John, one of the things that I think is really interesting that we've talked about before is your framework for growth in EdTech, and how CEOs, how startups, how companies should be thinking about engaging with the right constituents, not always the federal government, and in fact, maybe not the federal government, but how do you engage with state agencies, local agencies? You mentioned that you've had a lot of experience dealing with state and local agencies, and you sort of know how they work, what some of the pitfalls are. Talk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you referenced this framework, and this is something I've been using with clients for a while. So given the uncertainty as it relates to potential funding shifts at the federal level to states, and we didn't really get into the 2026 budget yet, but there's a lot of insights based on the president's 2026 budget request that was submitted last week that can help guide us in our thought process there. But given those changes, potential changes, and the authority and flexibility that would be given back to states, this idea of engaging with state education agencies becomes increasingly important for education companies. So part of what I like to focus on with clients is to help them have sort of a consistent approach to assessing opportunities for their companies in different states. And this framework includes 4 different potential outcomes for which they need to assess their potential opportunity in states. So the first one is direct procurement from a state agency. There are states that have a propensity to do that for certain types of solutions. So I recommend to companies, you got to know that, first of all, if they have that propensity. And if there's good alignment with your solution and kind of where the state is at currently. And that might include a longer term sort of play to help secure a legislative appropriation for the category of solution that you're providing, or the service that your company provides. The days of earmarking those naming vendors in legislation are gone. But that's kind of the path to helping secure funding in a specific category. Second is approved lists. Oftentimes states will have approved lists. You can have approved vendor status for different categories of services and solutions. Education service agencies can play a role in that oftentimes, as they provide support to the state as directed by the state agency, or through collaborative, cooperative organizations that they create in states to provide that service. But getting on those approved lists is really important. So the first step is knowing, is that the practice here in the state? How does the ESA, or how do ESAs manage that if it's sort of delegated to them? And how does the state agency, if they oversee that, handle that process? The other one is just simply educating at the state level. And this is sort of to at least secure at a minimum an implied endorsement of your company and the effort that you should consider doing that. Engaging with the state agency and potentially other government leaders to know your brand, to have a good sense for some positive outcomes that you're delivering in the space, so that if somebody calls or if opportunities do arise, you're already on that short list of providers who are well thought of.
Is that so it is a list of providers who have passed some level of hurdle, but are not on the state approved list.
Yeah. So two is the formal approved list,
Yeah, right.
right? Getting on those. Number three is just the value that comes from making sure that key decision makers and influencers in state government, the agency in particular, know your brand,
Got
know the
it.
services you provide, and that you're having a positive impact, especially if you've got district customers already in the state. So
So
much
those
more informed.
new district customers call the state and say, we're thinking about this particular vendor, this particular product, and they say, oh yeah, 3 districts are using it and we're hearing good things.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Then the fourth, and this one's really emerged. It used to be a framework focused more on the first three, but the fourth, especially over the past few months with the new administration, is to assess your company's go-to-market strategy in specific states relative to risk that could be political at this point in time, could be policy changes, could be funding changes, and then being in a situation to defend your market share. So I'll share some examples. I've talked with a number of CEOs and go-to-market leaders in companies recently who have had their solutions sort of categorized into some of the targeted categories by the current administration. If they have some focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or even social and emotional learning, those can be targeted based on current policy at the state and federal level. And so, I had a client share with me recently that they received calls from current customers who said, hey, we need to know if you have any DEI provisions in your marketing or solutions or as part of the focus when you deliver those solutions. And you need to let us know that within a couple of weeks. And if not, if you do, we're gonna have to cancel your contract. And the person making the request said, I need to know that within a couple of weeks, or I'm gonna lose my job. So again, this is sort of the type of reaction that we're seeing in the market.
Yeah.
So knowing where your solution sits, and that's just one example, and being able to defend that market share with the right decision makers and influencers is important.
John, that's I don't know what to say, an interesting example. I'll just say it that way. Are there any others that are a function of the political dynamics that we're living in today? Anything else that's come up that you're just like, hey, we know this is about to happen. We've got to pay attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's also there's a growing trend in education and has been, and I'll touch on this as we kind of get into strategies, where evidence has become the focus, evidence of impact
Right.
for solutions
Right.
and services. And there's kind of two pathways of focus there. Certain states might be focused on evidence of impact from a return on investment perspective that's financial. Others might be more focused on academic impact. But understanding those dynamics and how to tailor your messaging to both philosophies and approaches by states is really important. And so I'll work with clients to help them sort of develop a process for assessing these opportunities using the framework and kind of come up with a propensity score. Because one of the biggest challenges in our market is that in the US, is that it's 50 different markets, all this variability from state to state. And so especially for smaller to growth stage companies, having target states where you've got good alignment and good intel, supporting and informing your sales and go-to-market strategy is really important. But how do you prioritize those, right? So this helps with that.
That's great. Thank you. We do have 3 questions that have poured in the last few minutes, so I'm gonna switch over to those. The first one is from Alex Thorson. Just want to confirm Title II, III, and IV funds would also be largely secure for 2025 without an act of Congress.
That's correct. That's correct. Oh, 2, 3, and 4?
2, 3,
Yeah.
and 4.
Yeah, that's correct. Now, we should probably get to looking forward in the budget process for 2026, because for 3 in particular, and 2 for that matter, there are potential impacts that we see given the budget request from the executive branch. So when you want to get there, Keith, you let me know. But 2025, barring the act of Congress, funding is largely secure.
I think if you have a point of view on what it looks like in 26 for Title II and III, jump into it. I think Alex would appreciate it.
Yeah, and um, so we have visibility into the president's budget request for 2026. Um, Title I secure, IDA is secure, but the budget request proposes that those programs be reorganized into separate single or block grant programs to give to states, and then also giving them flexibility to spend those funds as they see fit. There's been some headlines around that. So, for example, Title III for English language learners. That's about 890 million in the current budget year. I saw a highlight that said that that would be eliminated. And the headline's a little misleading. First of all, it shouldn't be eliminated for 2025. And looking forward, the proposal from the president, again, this has to all be authorized by Congress. So we'll see how it plays out. But the proposal is consolidating funding from programs that include Title III, Title I, Title IIA, Title IIIA and B, the formula-based grant programs into these blocks or larger grants, single funding streams that then they could administer to states and allow states to spend as they like. So in some cases, I think the interpretation in the headlines is, oh, well, this particular program and funding was not mentioned. That must mean it's being cut. When at this point, the budget request is more indicating that these programs will be consolidated. And again, this is all contingent on the budgeting process that Congress is going to begin now that the budget request has been submitted. If that process worked correctly, and we're well behind in the process for 2026 in terms of timeline, there are 12 appropriation bills that Congress has to draft as part of the budget process. And those have to be drafted and agreed upon. Very arduous process. And then by the end of June, they should be sent to the president for signature in order to fund the government for the October 1st fiscal year. Probably not going to happen. Probably going to require a continuing resolution given where we're at.
Okay. So I'm going to skip a couple questions because it looks like there's one tagging onto this. And I think maybe you answered it though. Sally asks, we're hearing that there are significant, excuse me, we're hearing that there are significant cuts to these title funds. What insights do you have in this area? I think that's what you were just getting at.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So as we look at the 2026 budget, there's a few things that we do know in terms of what the president has proposed. So the reduction in total K-12 funding based request is about 4. That's about 15% of the department's current funding total. And again, that includes references to certain programs in the context of what I just shared. The total federal budget will for 2026 that's requested includes about a 20% non-defense spending reduction board. So there definitely will be some reductions in funding and definitely will be some impact on K-12 funding in 2026. It's just yet to be determined.
Okay, got it. Next question is from Pete Maston. Thanks for the question, Pete. He says, Learny is a workforce training platform and has been adopted by school systems for teacher PD. We're looking at charter schools as a great target. What is the best way to reach out to charter schools?
So great question, and I have an affinity for charter schools. So federal funding sources for professional development fall under Title II. Keep that in mind. In terms of outreach to charter schools, I mean, the traditional approaches are great, reaching out to key buyer personas in those, using the typical channels that you'll use. But I will say that charter school associations in different states and national organizations is a really good way to get engaged with leaders in those different institutions. So, for example, Arizona has a huge charter school population in the state. I think there are over 500 charter schools, maybe more than that, closer to 6. But the Arizona Association of Charter Schools is very active at the state level. And so getting to know those organizations, participating in events with charter school associations is a really good way to network with them and to find opportunities to, share your value proposition specifically aligned with their needs.
All right, thank you, John. Now we've got another question. They're pouring in. This is great.
Right.
This one is from Riley Walker, and Riley asks, states are increasingly recognizing the importance of AI literacy in education as they see it as essential for preparing students for a future in which AI and automation play a central role. With that said, and considering the new administration, are there certain states that are more bullish on this compared to others?
I don't know that I could quickly articulate which states are more bullish on AI than others. What I can say is that they're all focused on it, and you've probably seen the executive order from the Trump administration about AI education that came out. I think it was last month. By the way, if you haven't, as EdTech companies, if you haven't joined the EdSafe AI initiative and organization, I would highly recommend doing that. It's a collaborative between organizations that are promoting the effective implementation and use of AI specifically in education, and they had the opportunity to inform some of the language in that executive order. So I would highly recommend that. But from state to state, they're still figuring it out. I can say that there's recognition broadly that AI is here and that they need to establish some policy regarding effective use and ethical use. But they're all in different stages regarding, their understanding of it and the approach that they're taking to that.
John, we have a follow-up question that is related from Alex Thorson, who says, do you have any insight into CTE Perkins funds and also with some of the new executive orders surrounding AI and computer science? Do you foresee any new funding sources being created for those kinds of tools?
Yeah, great question. So for those who aren't aware, Perkins focuses on CTE funding. For 2025, I think the total allocation was about 1.4 billion. And that's largely formula grants to states, but often competitive grants then to local education agencies or districts, right? So there hasn't been any mention about new funding sources focused on CTE specifically. I do think that falls in the area of focus, and there's a positive perspective by the Trump administration. Career and technical education and career development is a priority for them. But it's yet to be seen if that funding will change in 2026, and if so, how, or if additional funding sources might emerge.
Yeah, that's great. So we'll have to keep our eyes open on that point. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. Really appreciate that. As I said, we want to make sure we're getting to the things that are top of mind for you. So that was great. John, I think before I jumped into the questions, we were talking about what kinds of strategies CEOs of EdTech firms should be thinking about to deal with these emerging political dynamics. You had talked about investing in the concept of evidence of impact. And I don't know if you finished your thought on that before I interrupted you, or if we can move on to the next concept that you think is critical to talk through.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the thought's still in there somewhere, Keith. I'll dig it out. So yeah, evidence is increasingly important for education institutions to, again, help measure both academic and financial return on investment. And actually, under the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, many here may be familiar. That law requires that education interventions be, quote, evidence-based. And then it outlines 4 levels of evidence from level 4, which is sort of a sound rationale or a logic model indicating potential impact of your product or service on student outcomes, all the way up to a level 1, which is kind of the gold standard for research, which is a randomized control trial using treatment and control groups to measure and evaluate effectiveness. So one of the recommendations I make is for companies to start by investing in a logic model or rationale for impact. And that can become sort of your roadmap to guide further research on efficacy and what those activities should look like. And the cool thing about it is there's a number of companies, nonprofit and for-profit, who have emerged who can support those types of activities. And I can mention a few of those here. I mentioned Learn Platform, now part of Instructure. They do that work specifically for education service providers. Lean Lab's doing some great work there. Empirical Education's doing great work. And of course, Digital Promise has a solution application that can be submitted to evaluate it and then issue badges that fall into these categories of research. So So there's great providers out there that do it in a very low cost and efficient way compared to traditional research, which might have taken, 2 years. You get more of an autopsy back in terms of the data and correlation to outcomes, and it's antiquated by the time you receive it. So the market has moved in a positive direction on that front.
That's very encouraging.
Yep. Yep.
And we'll maybe share the links to the firms that you mentioned as well, so that people can track those down if they don't already know them.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. One other quick related topic that I'll
Yeah.
mention, Keith. There is a trend emerging in K-12 education in particular called outcome-based contracting. Some of you may have heard of it. And so what it is a model for structuring purchase agreements with educational institutions where providers, when they sell an annual subscription to a customer, where say 40% of that annual subscription amount is paid up front, and the remaining subscription amount, say that remaining 60%, is paid based on the achievement of mutually agreed upon outcomes written into the actual contract. And this initiative is being promoted by several organizations across K-12, including the Center for Outcome-Based Contracting and its partners, and it's gaining momentum. So my advice here is to at least begin to think about how you might address the question if it comes up, or the request if it comes up from a state or from a local education agency, and then how you might think about structuring those contracts in an appropriate way for your business, and be prepared at least to have those conversations, because they're going to come.
Yeah, that seems like a significant shift, and one that you really need to be prepared to have that conversation and structure an engagement.
It is
in a way that's a win-win.
Yeah, for sure. And as SaaS companies, we don't like contracts with contingencies, because that can impact revenue rec, right? And so
always does impact rev
Yep.
rec, right? So
got to think about that.
Yeah, but it's the edtech market is so interesting in that it is so much more dynamic and complex than most other markets. And these things, you have to be, edtech CEOs always have to be on their toes.
Yeah.
And it's just unbelievable as I've gotten, I wouldn't say smarter, but more exposed to the edtech market through the work that we do with several of our customers. I'm amazed at how on their toes CEOs of these companies always have to be, because you just never know what's coming around the corner. And certainly that's the case today. But I've observed that and been impressed with how these CEOs deal with what's coming around the corner on a regular basis. We do have another question. I'm going to pull it in here. This is from Michael, who says, not a native speaker. Pardon me on my grammar, no worries. Given the notion of the current administration to uplift/revive the secondary industry of the states, do you think there might be a shift in the importance of career navigation and the importance of certifications? Interesting question. For K-12 students who wish not to pursue college degrees.
Yeah, great question. Somebody a little focused on higher ed there. We haven't even gotten into that. Obviously, significant implications on higher ed and what that might look like, post-secondary education and certifications. So I think yes, and I know that the thing we need to be aware of is that the answer to that question is going to vary from state to state, especially given the flexibility that's going to be transferred back to states if this plan comes to fruition, based on the budget requests that we've seen and the executive orders that we're seeing and the statements by the current administration. I touched on this earlier. There are 50 individual markets within the U.S. education market. And if we think about those changes that we've been discussing, if they play out, state education agencies are really complex organizations, and they're difficult to engage with from a sales perspective successfully. You never hear about state deals that just are really easy and that go well, and where you get the funding without any hiccups, right? And so, given the fact that we're gonna see an increase in flexibility at the state level, more than likely. And by the way, states aren't currently resourced to take on that administrative overhead. So what we're hearing is that states are likely going to hire consultants to help shape policy and procedures for funding administration and grant programs. because they're going to be given this flexibility. And so, of course, that will introduce new players and influencers at the state level in sales engagements. And so companies need to match this complexity with the right people, the right resources, the right strategy, and really use insights that they can get related to state policy and funding to inform your sales and go-to-market strategies. And so that's my second point is government relations, having a government relations function is critical. Somebody in your company needs to own and be responsible for that, right? At a minimum to track trends, funding, policy, and maybe that's an analyst role that can help do that. Others that do business with state agencies directly, it's even more significant in terms of the investment that you need to think about.
I think that's really interesting. And I'm curious, do you have a way that you think about how many government relations staff a company needs based on how its markets, based on how it approaches its market? As you said that, I was thinking, gosh, how would I make the decision of who to hire and how many of them to hire? And it would depend on where I am and in which states I'm doing business. But what's the framework for even figuring that out?
Yeah, so I think it's the same framework largely that we talked about previously, right? And so if your company offers a service or a solution, software program or system that state agencies might want to purchase directly, then the investment and probably the resourcing from a personnel standpoint is going to be higher, right? Because you're doing direct business with them. Getting on approved state lists still needs some focus and ownership on government relations and engagement, but it might be a little bit less because you're just trying to make sure that you're on approved lists. Maybe your sales account executives could own a portion of that. And maybe some of them are sophisticated enough to own much of the effort related to potential direct procurement within the states they're responsible for. And so I think that framework largely helps answer that question. But one of the questions that companies should be asking is, especially if they're in kind of that top tier in terms of outcomes and what they want to accomplish with states, is do we have sales representatives on staff who have the skill set to engage with the state agencies? In some cases, you may. I know a lot of sales professionals who have been focused on district sales, but also have the capacity to do well at the state level and find synergies between the two that can increase sales. In some cases, that doesn't work, but you need to ask yourself that question.
Wow, that's a great answer. Thank you. Okay, keep going. I think you still had some more insights to share in terms of the strategies to deal with this changing landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big challenges that I know CEOs and go-to-market teams are struggling with right now, it has to do with being able to forecast among these in the midst of these shifts and the uncertainties. And look, all the research, and I think most of us are probably aware of this, but all the research today tells us that today's buyers are complex. Especially when you're dealing with government institutions or even businesses, B2B, it's a similar dynamic. Sales engagements can be sort of looping, right, and ongoing. And I think Gartner did a study not long ago that shows that 5.5 people on average now have to agree or approve of purchases for those to happen. I think that's especially true with educational institutions. We know that they purchase in most cases, at least in medium-sized districts and above, by consensus through committee, right? And the other thing that Gartner highlighted was that like 40 to 60% of these sales end in no decision in these complex environments. Again, this sort of tendency to avoid what we have learned to call FOMO, right, or fear of messing up. These folks that are leading these departments in these government institutions don't want to make mistakes. That can cause some paralysis when it comes to decision making. And so being able to clearly and consistently articulate an understanding of their pain and challenges and how the capabilities that you offer and the benefits of your solution and services can help solve those is super important. And so there's a model that I've used for years with my teams when they're engaging with state or even school districts of size. And we call it pervasive selling. It's 5 by 5, meaning as you enter these engagements, you need to work toward, right, engaging and getting approval or support from 5 key decision makers in 5 different departments. And I include procurement. I include the superintendent of the agency in that, as well as obviously, the buyer for the department that's focused on your solution, the head of IT, the head of curriculum and instruction, head of assessment, go down the list, the key buyer personas that you typically engage with. So that's a really, really important one. Being pervasive, you often have to build consensus across multiple stakeholders. I remember a quick example, large district in the DC area. We've been having conversations with a director in a department, and literally her office was 3 doors down from another key decision maker in that district. We finally got a meeting to pull all the decision makers together, went to that meeting, and I saw the two of them say, "Hey, we haven't talked for 3 months. So good to see you." And then they joked about the fact that their offices are 3 doors apart. But that we got them in the room, and that gave us the opportunity to build consensus across multiple department heads that have varying priorities, but in the end needed to come around the objectives that we were working to achieve together.
I think that's such an interesting story. It's one of the observations that we see. One of the things that we see in the Edtech customers that we serve. We know it takes them many cycles to figure out what is the right sales motion, what is the right set of decision makers to get something across the finish line. And I said earlier that EdTech is an incredibly complex market. This is another thing that reinforces that for me. Is it's so hard to get the right level of consensus and the right decision makers to all make the decision at the same time. Just an extraordinary challenge. And I love the framework for that because what we see is, especially in the very earliest stages of an EdTech business, I'm not saying anything anybody doesn't already know, but it takes multiple selling seasons to figure out what does that really look like for my product and my company. In your experience, John, how many selling seasons, how many years does it take for a company to figure out, okay, this is what it takes for me to get my product across the finish line?
Well, I think it's an ever evolving process
Ah,
in government sales, which is really what we're part of here,
yeah,
in that it changes from year to year, and there's uncertainty from year to year. And one of the biggest challenges is that leadership in these institutions turns over from year to year. But I do think, I think for early stage companies once they get through that first cycle,
yeah,
get through the budgeting year with the institutions that they're targeting, and this assumes they have an institutional sales function already in place, and it's not still founder-led sales. That's grueling, to your point, for founders to try to keep
yeah,
the pulse of the market and lead the go-to-market efforts. That's a tough one.
yeah.
It's a hard one. But assuming you've got a formal sales function in place, it takes a full cycle. You'll learn a ton through that first cycle. And through the second year of selling, I think you're starting to apply learnings, and then it just builds from there. I think within 3 years, I see companies being really, really effective in terms of having a repeatable, scalable process that yields results.
Just requires
Yeah.
focused and intentional effort there to keep learning and learning.
Yeah, yeah. There's just a couple other quick points that I'll make on
Yeah,
this. And one of them's more tactical, but one of the things that I think is vitally important for companies to have, and so this is kind of getting into sales process, I think is related to your question. How do we implement a sales process that ensures that our reps are doing the right things to give us visibility as a business into what deals are actually going to close and what the true status of those deals are? And one of the most important things that you can do is to make sure that that sales process that your reps use and that hopefully is implemented in your CRM, if you have one, right? That the stages reflect the buyer's activities, not necessarily what the salesperson thinks they
that's
should be doing, but the buyer's activities, right? And how
very
they're going to
important,
do
very
business.
important hack here. Very important to build your sales process like that. I'm really glad that you mentioned that. Absolutely critical, no
Yeah.
matter what your industry.
Absolutely. It absolutely is. So if I'm a rep and I'm working with a state education agency or a district or a charter school, I'm making my weekly updates on opportunities, right? Because that's what all reps do as part of their sales activities. So I'm in HubSpot or I'm in Salesforce, and I can look at the stages and I can see, hey, what are the exit criteria before I move it to the next stage that clearly indicate the questions that I should ask to verify the buyer's activities and what the buyer needs to do business with us. because that's the biggest challenge. I always share, these are meant with love and positive intention, these two comments. One is we're dealing with some of the more dysfunctional organizations on the planet, right? And I always tell reps, and this isn't intentional, this is because you've got great educators and administrators who are focused on teaching and learning. But when it comes to the business relationship with companies, it can be really challenging. And I always tell them, hey, there's no one who's going to be more misled during this sales process than you as the salesperson. So you need to triangulate. You need to have multiple connections, 5 by 5, to mitigate the risk as you're going through the engagement.
That's excellent. John, we have one last question that I'll read to you here, and then I think that'll probably cover us for the time. So this one is from Riley. The outcome-based results contracts are really interesting, especially if they're paying 40% up front. For private versus charter versus traditional public schools, which type of organization is more interested in this model?
So the Center for Outcome-Based Contracting, which is through a foundation in Atlanta, they have been working with a cohort of districts, a couple of cohorts for districts, I think, over the past couple of years. So it's primarily been focused with public institutions. But I would anticipate from charters and private school organizations, there might be, as this catches on, there might be even more of an appetite for structuring contracts that way than even in public institutions. So we can share the link out to the Center for Outcome-Based Contracting and its initiative after this, Keith. I think that might be helpful.
Yeah, we definitely will. And we'll send a follow-up email to everybody who attended and make sure that these links, these organizations that you've talked about, we have links to all of them.
Yep.
John, we have 2 more minutes before we say our goodbyes. Anything you want to, any last bits of wisdom you want to drop?
Well, I don't know if it's wisdom, but again, it's sort of learned experience, right? And I always share with clients.
I think that's the definition of wisdom, actually.
Yeah. I always share with clients, hey, what I'm gonna help you with are based on experience-based best practices, right? It's things that I've been through and done and have learned from challenges and opportunities. We've been through cycles similar to this before. Now there's been proposals in the past to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. This one seems to have more teeth. We'll see if it's completely eliminated or just scaled down to a point where it's minimal resources and functions, but we'll get through it. We'll figure it out. And I think these types of engagements and discussions, Keith, like Novel and your team are hosting, are critical. We've got to keep the conversation going. We've got to share thoughts and ideas, because in the end, we're all trying to make education in our K-12 and higher ed systems better. And the folks on the call today play one of the most critical roles in doing that. So let's keep the conversation going and work together to adapt as we need to.
Totally agree, and this is why we love having these conversations. We view this as critical, and we want to do everything that we can to help companies continue to build and have a positive impact. John, thank you so much for joining us today. I know I learned a lot. I suspect everybody else did too. Liliana, if you want to pop our slides up to show contact information, but while we're doing that, John, how can people get in touch with you if they want to track you down?
Yeah, absolutely. We can publish out my contact info. I think I've got my email address there and my LinkedIn, but also alidadeconsult.com is my website. So I'll drop that into the chat as well, or maybe Liliana can, but it's ALIDADE consult, CONSULT.com. And I've got great information there about the kinds of services I provide, as well as a slew of letters of recommendation from CEOs and heads of growth for companies over the past few years.
Anybody who needs some help, get in touch with John. Do it quick. All right. Thanks again, John, so much for your time. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope it was informative and helpful to you. And we'll see you next time.
Yep. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.